The steady, rhythmic hum of a Boeing 747's engines was the soundtrack to Hal Crafts' life. From 30,000 feet, the world was a tapestry of twinkling lights and sprawling landscapes, a view that never lost its magic. For Hal, a flight attendant for the iconic Pan Am Airlines, this cabin was her office, a place of order and polite smiles, a world away from the creeping chaos that had begun to define her life on the ground. She moved through the aisle with an easy grace, the crisp blue uniform a suit of armor, her warm, professional demeanor a mask for the fear that was becoming a constant, unwelcome passenger in her own mind. She had a rare gift for making people feel at ease, a genuine warmth that could soothe a crying baby or calm a nervous first-time flyer. Her colleagues adored her for her unflappable nature and her quick, dry wit that could cut through the tension of a delayed flight. She was the one they turned to for advice, for a shoulder to cry on, for a shared laugh in a hotel bar in a city whose name they'd forget by morning. She was worldly, fluent in multiple languages, and carried herself with a European elegance that hinted at her Danish roots. But beneath the polished exterior was a devoted mother, whose thoughts were never far from her 3 children back home in the quiet, bucolic town of Newtown, Connecticut. The flights were a means to an end, a way to provide them with a life she'd only dreamed of as a young girl in Denmark. Each takeoff was a bittersweet departure, and every landing was a joyful countdown to the moment she would walk back through her own front door. But lately, the landings had been tinged with a cold dread. The rambling house that was supposed to be her sanctuary had started to feel like a cage, a place of secrets and simmering resentment. The man she had once loved, the father of her children, had become a stranger to her, his moods as unpredictable and dangerous as a sudden patch of turbulence. She confided in a few close friends, her voice a strained whisper over the phone lines that stretched across continents. She told them about his coldness, his lies, his increasingly erratic behavior. She even spoke the unspeakable, a chilling premonition that she tucked into the conversation like a dark secret. "If something happens to me," she'd said, the words hanging heavy in the air, "don't assume it was an accident. It was a plea, a warning, a desperate message in a bottle cast out into the world, hoping someone would find it before the tide came in." If you want to hear more true crime stories, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Newtown, Connecticut, in the mid-1980s, was the embodiment of the American dream, a postcard-perfect town nestled in the rolling hills of New England. It was a place of sprawling colonial homes, manicured lawns, and a quiet, unshakable sense of security. This was a community where doors were often left unlocked, where children rode their bikes freely down tree-lined streets, until the fireflies began to dance at dusk. Crime was something that happened in the gritty, distant cities, a headline in the newspaper that felt a world away. Newtown was a haven for families, particularly for those like the Crafts, who worked in the airline industry. Its proximity to New York's major airports made it an ideal commuter town for pilots and flight attendants seeking a peaceful, pastoral life. There was a unique subculture among these airline families. The men, like Richard Crafts, were often seen as dashing figures, modern-day adventurers who commanded powerful machines and traversed the globe. Their lives seemed glamorous, filled with exotic layovers and handsome salaries. Their wives, many of them former flight attendants like Hal, managed the sprawling homes and raised the children, holding down the fort during their husbands' long absences. But beneath this glossy veneer of affluence and adventure, a different reality could fester. The long separations, the constant jet lag, and the temptations of life on the road could strain even the strongest marriages. Secrets took root in the quiet loneliness of the big houses, and resentments simmered behind the closed doors of the master bedrooms. Hal Crafts was living in the heart of this world, a world that demanded a certain image of success and domestic bliss. She played her part beautifully, hosting parties, raising her 3 beautiful children, and maintaining a home that was the envy of many. But the idyllic facade of Newtown, with its deep-seated belief in its own safety and normalcy, was about to be shattered. The evil that the residents believed was kept at bay, far beyond their town line, was in fact already inside. It was sleeping in one of their beds, eating at one of their dinner tables, and methodically planning a crime so savage and unthinkable it would forever stain the town's peaceful image and introduce a new, terrifying vocabulary into the lexicon of American crime. The late autumn chill of November 18, 1986, clung to the air as Hal's friend, Lisbeth, navigated her car down the winding country roads toward the Crafts' home. The journey from West Germany had been exhausting, a blur of time zones and recycled cabin air, and all Hal wanted was the comfort of her own bed. Inside the warm car, the conversation was a mixture of fatigue and apprehension. Hal stared out the window at the familiar landscape, the bare trees clawing at the bruised twilight sky. But her mind was elsewhere. She spoke of the divorce, the finality of it. She had the evidence she needed, the black and white proof of Richard's infidelities, and she was no longer willing to live a lie. As they turned onto the long driveway, the house stood silhouetted against the horizon, its windows dark and unwelcoming. A profound sense of isolation washed over Hal, a feeling so palpable that Lisbeth felt it too. As the car came to a stop, Hal turned to her friend, her usually bright eyes clouded with a deep, unsettling fear. "I just want this to be over," she whispered. Lisbeth reached out, squeezing her hand. "It will be. You're strong." But as Hal got out of the car and the taillights disappeared down the road, she was left alone with the silence and the cold. The familiar crunch of gravel under her feet sounded unnaturally loud in the evening stillness. Inside, the house was quiet, but it was a heavy, watchful quiet. Her husband, Richard Crafts, an airline pilot for Eastern Airlines and a part-time police officer, was there. The conversation that followed is lost to time, its words and its venom swallowed by the walls of the house. But it was the final conversation, the last chapter in a marriage that had curdled from love into a toxic brew of infidelity and animosity. The confrontation was inevitable. She wanted a divorce, a clean break, a chance to start over with her children. For Richard, this was not just an emotional threat, but a financial one. A divorce meant alimony, child support, the division of assets. It was an equation he was unwilling to solve. The argument likely escalated, the carefully constructed facade of their suburban life cracking under the pressure. Investigators would later theorize that in the master bedroom, the room they had once shared, the final violent act took place. A blunt object, heavy and unforgiving, brought Hal's life to an abrupt and brutal end. And as the first flakes of a gathering snowstorm began to drift down from the leaden sky, blanketing the town of Newtown in a pristine, silent shroud of white, Hal Crafts, the vibrant mother of three, the globe-trotting flight attendant, vanished from the face of the earth. In the days that followed Hal's disappearance, Richard Crafts began to weave a tangled web of lies. His stories were fluid, changing with each person he spoke to, each inquiry he deflected. To one of Hal's concerned friends, he'd say she'd gone to Denmark to visit her ailing mother, a trip he claimed was sudden and unplanned. To another, he'd casually mention she'd run off with an old friend, perhaps to the Canary Islands, for a much-needed break. He was a portrait of unconcern, a man seemingly untroubled by his wife's sudden absence. But his calm was a performance, and the cracks were already beginning to show. His friends in Hal's circle were to very different worlds, and they were starting to compare notes. The conflicting narratives created a jarring dissonance, an alarm bell that grew louder with each passing day. The friend who had dropped Hal off that fateful night knew she hadn't packed a bag for a transatlantic flight. Another knew Hal would never, under any circumstances, leave her children without a word. The story of a spontaneous vacation felt hollow, a poorly constructed alibi that didn't fit the woman they knew. Hal was meticulous, a planner. She lived by flight schedules and timetables. The idea of her simply vanishing into thin air was preposterous. The private investigator Hal had hired, a shrewd and persistent man named Keith Mayo, was perhaps the most skeptical of all. He had been building a case against Richard for the divorce proceedings, and he knew the depths of the man's duplicity. When Hal's calls to him abruptly stopped, Mayo's professional concern quickly morphed into genuine fear for her safety. He began calling the Crafts' residence, only to be met with Richard's smooth, dismissive reassurances. Richard's tone was all wrong. It lacked the frantic edge of a worried husband. There was no desperation in his voice, no plea for information. There was only a cold, confident annoyance. The friends, now a determined and worried collective, decided to take their fears to the authorities. They went to the Newtown Police Department, expecting a swift and serious response. Instead, they were met with a frustrating wall of indifference. Richard Crafts wasn't just a local pilot. He was a volunteer police officer, one of their own. The officers on duty saw a domestic dispute, a wife who had likely just left her husband after a fight. They offered calming platitudes, suggesting she would return when she had cooled off. They knew Richard. He was a family man, a pillar of the community. The idea that he was capable of foul play seemed absurd to them. But for Hell's friends, this dismissal was a chilling affirmation of their worst fears. They knew Richard's other side, the man behind the uniform, the man with the volatile temper and the wandering eye. They left the police station that day feeling unheard and terrified, realizing with a sinking heart that if they were going to find out what happened to Hell, they were on their own. Keith Mayo, the private investigator, was a man who trusted his gut, and his gut was screaming that Richard Crafts was a liar. Frustrated by the inaction of the Newtown police, Mayo took his concerns to a higher authority, the county prosecutor. He laid out the timeline, the inconsistencies in Richard's stories, and Hell's own chilling words: "If something happens to me, don't assume it was an accident." The prosecutor listened, and unlike the local police, he saw past Richard's reputation. He saw a pattern of deception that demanded a real investigation. The case was handed over to the Connecticut State Police. Detective Robert Foley of the Western District Major Crime Squad caught the file. He was a seasoned investigator, a man who had seen the dark underbelly of human nature that lurked even in quiet towns like Newtown. He read Mayo's report, then read it again. It was thin, built on hearsay and suspicion, but the final quote from Hell resonated with him. It wasn't the sound of a woman leaving. It was the sound of a woman who feared she would be silenced. On December 26th, while Richard and the children were away on a vacation in Florida, a trip that seemed disturbingly celebratory under the circumstances, Foley and his team executed a search warrant on the Crafts' home. The house on the hill, which had appeared so normal from the outside, began to give up its dark secrets. The search was methodical, painstaking. Detectives moved through the rooms, their eyes scanning for anything out of place. They found it in the master bedroom. The family's nanny was questioned, and she recalled a strange detail. Just after Hell went missing, she had noticed a dark, grapefruit-sized stain on the bedroom carpet. Richard had explained it away as spilled kerosene, but soon after, the entire section of carpeting had been cut away and removed. The excuse was flimsy, the action deeply suspicious. Troopers examined the exposed floorboards, but the real discovery was on the side of the master bed's mattress, a series of dark smears, almost invisible against the pattern fabric. They looked like blood. The section of the mattress was carefully excised and sent to the state forensic lab for analysis. The gears of the investigation were finally, belatedly, turning. But the house was just the beginning. The real evidence lay hidden in the mundane transactions of Richard's daily life, recorded on flimsy slips of paper. Detectives subpoenaed his credit card records, and in the cold, hard data of his recent purchases, a horrifying narrative began to take shape. There was a charge for a brand new chest freezer, a large model, far bigger than the family would need. But when investigators searched the house, the freezer was nowhere to be found. Then there were charges for new bedding, a comforter, sheets, and a dust ruffle. It was a strange purchase for a man whose wife had just left him. Why redecorate the bedroom for her return? The most chilling receipt of all was for the rental of a large, industrial-grade wood chipper. The rental period coincided precisely with the days following Hell's disappearance. A freezer, new bedding, and a machine designed to reduce large branches to a pile of tiny chips. Individually, they were innocuous purchases. Together, they formed the blueprint for a monstrous act, a plan so cold and calculated, it was almost beyond comprehension. Late one night, Detective Foley sat alone in his office, the world outside silent and dark. The only light came from a desk lamp that cast a harsh glare on the documents spread before him. The credit card receipts were laid out like tarot cards, each one telling a piece of a grim future. The freezer, the bedding, the wood chipper. On the wall, a large map of Newtown, and the surrounding area was covered in pins and notes. Foley stared at it, his coffee long since gone cold. He was trying to build a timeline, to make sense of the monster he was hunting. Richard Crafts was a pilot. He was trained in precision, in checklists, in executing complex procedures under pressure. This wasn't a crime of passion, Foley thought. This was a logistical operation. The purchase of the freezer wasn't an afterthought. It was step one. He imagined Richard in the store, calmly selecting the largest model, paying with a credit card as if he were buying a new set of tires. The sheer audacity was staggering, but the freezer was missing. Where had it gone? And why the bedding? Foley picked up the crime scene photos from the master bedroom. The image of the excised piece of mattress with its faint, dark stains Richard had tried to clean up. The new bedding was part of the cover-up, an attempt to erase the scene, to create a new, pristine reality where his wife had simply packed a bag and left. But the central, most horrifying piece of the puzzle was the wood chipper, a Brush Bandit 100. Foley had looked it up, a powerful machine capable of turning a 12-inch log into a spray of fine particles. The rental period was key, November 20th, 2 days after Hell was last seen. 2 days of a raging blizzard. Who rents a wood chipper in a snowstorm? Foley traced a line on the map with his finger, following the Housatonic River as it snaked through the landscape. The river was deep, cold, and powerful. It was a perfect disposal site, a place that could swallow evidence and carry it away. He felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. Richard Crafts hadn't just hidden his wife's body. He had tried to obliterate it. He had treated her like a piece of inconvenient yard waste. The thought filled Foley with a cold rage. This was no longer just a missing person case. This was a hunt for a man who had committed an almost unimaginable act of desecration. The challenge was immense. Without a body, his case was a house of cards. He needed something tangible, something that proved Hell was dead and that Richard had killed her. He stared at the map of the river, at the dozens of bridges and access points. It was a massive search area. Finding anything would be like finding a single grain of sand on a mile-long beach. But he had to try. He had to find a voice for the woman whose own husband had so brutally silenced her. The investigation had a theory, a gruesome and almost unbelievable one, but they lacked a location. They knew what Richard Crafts had likely done, but not where he had done it. The answer came from an unexpected source, a man just doing his job on a cold November night. Joseph Hine was a local snowplow driver for the town of Southbury. On the night Hell Crafts vanished, a fierce snowstorm had swept through Connecticut, and Hine was out on the roads, clearing the way. As he made his way toward the steel bridge, a structure that spanned the icy expanse of the Housatonic River, his headlights cut through the swirling snow and illuminated a strange scene. A rental truck with a large wood chipper hitched to its back was parked by the shore of Lake Zoar, a wide, placid part of the river. It was an odd time and place for landscaping work, especially in a blizzard. Hine didn't think much of it at the time, just another strange sight on a long and lonely shift. But when news of Hell's disappearance and the ongoing state police investigation began to circulate, the memory resurfaced, clicking into place with a dreadful significance. He contacted the authorities. Hine's tip was the key that unlocked the entire case. He led detectives to the exact spot on the riverbank where he had seen the truck and the wood chipper. It was now late December, and the ground was frozen solid, covered in a thick blanket of snow. The task ahead seemed impossible. If Richard Crafts had used the wood chipper to dispose of his wife's body, the evidence would be microscopic, scattered, and buried under the winter landscape. It was a challenge that would have daunted most, but the Connecticut State Police, led by the brilliant and tenacious Dr. Henry Lee, were about to conduct one of the most remarkable forensic searches in the history of law enforcement. They brought in pumps and began to systematically thaw the frozen ground, melting away the snow and ice. The cold, muddy water was then painstakingly filtered through fine mesh screens. For days, troopers in heavy winter gear knelt in the freezing mud, their eyes scanning the screens for anything, any fragment that could prove Hell Crafts had met her end on this desolate shore. The work was slow, grueling, and emotionally taxing. They were searching for the last, brutalized remnants of a human being. It was a grim and sacred duty. And then they started to find them. The frozen riverbank, under the meticulous gaze of Dr. Lee's team, began to yield its horrifying secrets. The first discoveries were minuscule, tiny fragments of blue fiber, slivers of metal. Then came the first piece of biological evidence, a discovery that sent a jolt through the weary search party. It was a human fingernail, perfectly preserved by the cold and coated in a delicate shade of pink nail polish. A friend of Hell's would later confirm that it was the exact shade she had been wearing. The search intensified. Sifting through the cold slurry, troopers found more. A human toenail, bone chips, many no larger than a grain of rice, that showed the distinct markings of having been forced through a powerful machine. Then came a discovery that was both gruesome and forensically invaluable: the crown of a human tooth. The search continued, yielding a grim harvest. They collected 2,660 strands of bleached blonde human hair, tangled in the debris along the shoreline. They found 5 tiny droplets of blood, type O, the same as Hell's. The sheer volume of this microscopic evidence painted a clear, terrifying picture. A human body had been systematically destroyed on this very spot. While the search of the riverbank continued, a team of police divers braved the frigid, murky waters of the Housatonic River. They swept the riverbed with powerful underwater metal detectors, searching for the tools Richard would have needed. Their search was rewarded. Half buried in the silt, they found a chainsaw. When they brought it to the surface, they could see that the serial number had been crudely filed off, a deliberate attempt to make it untraceable. But forensic science had an answer for that, too. In the lab, technicians used a process of acid etching to restore the obliterated numbers. The serial number became visible again, a ghost resurrected by chemistry. It was traced to the original retailer, whose records confirmed, unequivocally, that the chainsaw had been purchased by Richard Crafts. More damning still, wedged within the teeth of the chainsaw's cutting bar were traces of human hair and tissue. The pieces were all there, scattered between the riverbank and the riverbed. The credit card receipts had provided the blueprint. The witness had provided the location. And now, the forensic evidence provided the horrifying, undeniable proof. The tooth crown was taken to a forensic odontologist, who compared it to Hellcraft's dental records. It was a perfect match. On January 13, 1987, based on this single, crucial piece of evidence, the Connecticut State Medical Examiner's Office took an unprecedented step. They issued a death certificate for Hellcrafts. Her cause of death was listed as homicide. With the official declaration of her death, the final barrier to justice was removed. On the day of his arrest, Richard Crafts was the picture of suburban normalcy, right up until the moment the unmarked state police cars pulled into his driveway. He was brought to a small, sterile interrogation room, a stark contrast to the sprawling cockpit of his 727. Detective Foley sat across from him, a thick file on the table between them. Richard was calm, almost bored, a slight smirk playing on his lips. He believed he was smarter than them. He believed he had committed the perfect crime. "Richard," Foley began, his voice even, "we need to talk about Hell." Richard leaned back, crossing his arms. "I've told you everything. She left. Maybe you should spend your time looking for her instead of harassing me." Foley slid a credit card receipt across the table. "You rented a wood chipper, Richard, on November 20th, in the middle of a blizzard." Richard glanced at the paper, his expression unchanged. "I was clearing some downed branches. The storm made a mess of the property. We spoke to the rental company," Foley said, his eyes locked on Richard's. "You told them you'd be using it in Newtown, but a snowplow driver saw you, miles away, down by the Housatonic River at the steel bridge, in the middle of the night." For the first time, a flicker of something annoyance, maybe, or the faintest hint of concern crossed Richard's face. But he recovered quickly. "The guy's mistaken. It wasn't me." Foley pushed another photograph across the table. It was a close-up of the chainsaw recovered from the river. "Recognize this? We know you filed the serial number off. But science is a funny thing, Richard. We were able to raise it. It traces back to a purchase you made 2 years ago." Richard stared at the photo, his jaw tight. He said nothing. Foley leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "We've been searching the riverbank, Richard. All that snow, we melted it. We sifted everything. We found hair, Hell's hair. We found bone fragments. We found a tooth cap that matches her dental records perfectly. We even found her fingernail. It had pink polish on it." He paused, letting the weight of the words fill the silent room. "You didn't just get rid of some branches, did you, Richard?" Richard Crafts remained silent, his mask of arrogant composure beginning to crack. He had planned for everything, he thought. He had accounted for every contingency. But he had not accounted for a persistent snowplow driver. He had not accounted for the tireless troopers who would spend weeks on their hands and knees in the freezing mud. And he had not accounted for the brilliant mind of Dr. Henry Lee, a man who could read a story in a single strand of hair. The interrogation ended with no confession. Richard Crafts was too arrogant, too narcissistic to ever admit what he had done. But as he was led away to a holding cell, the smirk was gone, replaced by the cold, hard realization that his perfect crime was unraveling, piece by microscopic piece. The trial of Richard Crafts was a landmark case, a legal battle that would test the very limits of the American justice system. For the first time in the history of Connecticut, the state would attempt to prosecute a murder without the victim's body. The prosecution's case rested on a mountain of circumstantial and forensic evidence, a complex puzzle painstakingly assembled by detectives and scientists. The defense's strategy was simple: no body, no crime. They argued that Helle Crafts could still be alive, that she had simply left her husband and started a new life somewhere else. The first trial began in May of 1988 in New London. Its location moved due to the intense, almost circus-like publicity the case had generated in its home county. For 54 days, the prosecution, led by state's attorney Walter Flanagan, laid out its case. They called Helle's friends to the stand, who tearfully recounted her growing fear of her husband. They put the private investigator on the stand, who detailed Richard's lies and evasions. The snowplow driver, Joseph Hine, gave his crucial eyewitness testimony, placing the wood chipper at the scene. But the star witness was Dr. Henry Lee. In a masterful display of forensic science, he walked the jury through the evidence found at the riverbank. He explained how the bone chips showed the telltale signs of being processed by a chipper. To demonstrate this, the state's medical examiner had conducted a grim but necessary experiment. He had taken a frozen pig carcass chosen for its similarity to human bone and tissue, and fed it through an identical wood chipper. The resulting bone fragments bore the exact same marks as those found by the Housatonic River. The evidence was compelling, but for one juror, it wasn't enough. For 17 agonizing days, the jury was deadlocked. One man, a stubborn holdout, refused to convict. He couldn't get past the fact that there was no body. On July 15, 1988, the judge had no choice but to declare a mistrial. Richard Crafts walked out of the courtroom a free man, at least for the time being. It was a devastating blow for Helle's family and friends, and a major setback for the prosecution. But they were not deterred. They knew they had the right man, and they were determined to try again. The second trial began a year later in Norwalk. Walter Flanagan stood before a new jury, his expression grim and determined. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice resonating through the tense courtroom. "This is a case about a puzzle where the largest, most important piece is missing. The defense will tell you that because this piece, the body of Helle Crafts, has not been found, the puzzle cannot be solved, but we are here to prove them wrong.